Hello and welcome to Penmanship, a podcast about Australian writing culture. I'm your host, Andrew McMillen, and before I introduce today's guest, I wanted to start with a brief note to you, my audience. If you are a regular listener, you might have noticed that there's been a pretty big gap between episodes, about 5 months by my count. There's a few reasons for that, the main one being that I decided to take a break to take stock of where the podcast fit into my creative output. You may or may not be aware that I'm a freelance journalist, and that's where I earn a living from writing magazine features and magazine-style features for the web. And penmanship for me, since the beginning, has just been a side project, a passion project that has allowed me to sit down with practitioners whose work I love to talk about the tricky business of building a life around working with words. And it's been a wonderful outlet. I've loved doing it and continue to love doing it. However, I have decided to take stock of my schedule, and as a result, I've decided to move from fortnightly episodes, which I was following throughout the last couple of years, to monthly episodes for the foreseeable future. So, thank you for your patience if you're a long-time listener, or if you're a first-timer, welcome, and please explore the back catalogue of great conversations. Now, my guest in episode 35 is Amelia Lester. For the first episode of 2017, I could think of few more qualified guests than Amelia Lester. Penmanship is all about exploring the gritty details of how to build a life around working with words, and Amelia has done just that at the very highest level of magazine publishing. After graduating from Harvard University, she worked at a literary agency for a year, and then achieved her dream of working at The New Yorker, which has long been regarded as one of the leading homes for long-form journalism in the English-speaking world. Amelia stayed there for 10 years in various editorial roles before returning to her home country to take the reins at Good Weekend, a magazine she loved to read while growing up in Australia. In early March, I met with Amelia at the Fairfax Media Building in Sydney. I have written for Good Weekend since 2014, and for Amelia since October, so this episode marks the second time I've interviewed a current editor of mine on penmanship, following last year's chat with Eric Jensen of the Saturday paper. My conversation with Amelia touches on what makes a great magazine feature story, her philosophy about how editors should manage their schedules to spend less time at the desk and more time out in the world, how she began working at The New Yorker as a fact-checker and then became managing editor by the time she was 26, why manners are important in journalism, how she learnt to manage her email inbox, and why she is leaving Good Weekend in April after a little over a year in the role. Introducing Amelia Lester, editor of Good Weekend. Amelia Lester, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
It's just after midday on Tuesday. Where are you in terms of Good Weekend's production cycle?
Well, the last few days have blended into each other a bit because Sydney is in the midst of a rain jag, the likes of which I'd never seen before. But usually on a Tuesday, I have to remind myself what we do, we produce the magazine on a 10-day lead time. So Wednesday is the final day of our production cycle. So on Tuesday, I'm usually ideally reading pieces that have already been laid out. But today we have an absolutely explosive cover story, which will be landing in people's newspapers, not this coming Saturday, but the following Saturday. And I'm still working through some legal issues with our tireless in-house counsel.
Wow, right. What is the number of staff who work on the magazine directly?
I have two editors who work with me, a deputy and an associate editor, and the associate editor is particularly adept at discovering which books are going to be the big books. I mean, her skill set is astonishing. She's got this ability to, of all the books that are coming out, she knows which ones people are going to be talking about. So she does a bajillion different things, but that's a big focus of what she does as associate editor. My deputy editor, Greg Callahan, is the long-form king. He can immediately tailor a piece and see exactly what needs to be done. He sort of thinks structurally. He thinks very big picture in how you tell a story most effectively. So he sort of performs surgery. He's the surgeon of the operation, if you like.
Well, then, where do you fit in amongst that as kind of the overlord, I suppose? Looking over the whole kingdom each week and seeing how it fits together.
Yes, it's very Westeros. I think my particular skill set is in figuring out the mix of stories and in working on a story from its conception and from the idea through to its execution, how it's presented in the magazine, how we sell the story. And of course, I have a lot of help in that process of figuring out how to sell the story from the art department. And the art director of Good Weekend, Tim Bior, is the finest art director I've ever worked with. He is just an astonishingly talented individual, and you can tell him sort of basically what a story is, and he'll figure out how to package it in such a way where you'll just have to rip open the magazine and read it. He is very ably assisted by the Good Weekend art director, Tara Axford, and she is also brilliant at laying out the story on the page in a way that looks appealing. So I like stepping back a little bit, I like working on figuring out how the whole package of a story comes together, and then how each of those stories fit with one another so that it's a pleasant, enticing, surprising reading experience. And of course, I would be remiss to not mention the photography editor, who I just think photography in Good Weekend is absolutely world-class, second to none. And then the subs, we're very lucky to still have in-house subs, which is something very few publications in this day and age have. The role of the sub is something that's a bit different between Australia and the US. That's something that we can get into if you'd like a little later on. But the subs take a much more hands-on role here in terms of, again, that process of figuring out how to sell a story.
Mm-hmm. You've been involved with magazines for some time, which we'll cover in this interview. I just wanted a really broad question. What, in your opinion, makes a great magazine story?
I thought you were going to ask me what makes a great magazine, and I have a very pat answer for that, which is that I think surprise makes a great magazine, which is why I never read the table of contents in a magazine, because I want each page to be a new surprise. What makes a good magazine story is, I think, a more complicated question. Ideally, you'd have a surgeon like Greg working on it. I think to tell a good magazine story, look, the key difference is a magazine story is told at length versus a newspaper story. That's the most superficial difference. We can get into some other differences a little later. But if you're telling a story at length, you have to figure out how to keep someone reading. So I noticed that increasingly people talk about long form as though it's vegetables. It's like eating your vegetables. Like news organizations are like, and we have long form journalism, as though it's like, and we've got the broccoli that keeps you feeling like you're reading a quality product. I think long form should be stories you can't put down. That's why they're long, because they've got a great story to tell and you don't want to put down the magazine. So I'm constantly having to remind people, not practitioners so much as other people involved in the media industry, that long form is just really fascinating stories, and they need to be told at length because that's how much space they need.
Right. Yeah, there can sometimes be that overlap between thinking that just because something is long, it is therefore good.
Yes.
I'm sure you've encountered that as well. So a good editor, I think, from a writer's perspective, is one who knows how long a story should be, what to cut, and what should stay in order to keep the reader engaged.
Yes, and you're very good at feeling your way through that problem. And I think part of what you identify in a story and part of what is important to make a story sing at length is that you need details and you need characters. On the details point, that's something I know that my writers get very bored of hearing from me, because they say he was wearing a t-shirt, and I say, what color t-shirt? Or it was high up in the office building, what floor was it on? Because I think those details contribute to your sense of it being a vivid story for the reader. Character is also very important because long-form journalism is about reportage. It's not an essay. People need to feel invested in the characters. They need to feel like they know these people and that they care about what happens to them. So if you've got the details and you've got the characters, and of course there's an interplay between those two components too, then you've got the makings of a story that sings.
Without characters, it's just a dry collection of facts. In some cases, you really need someone to latch on to kind of guide you through whatever the story is about.
Exactly. And most of the time in long form, that's someone who is not you, the writer, right? Like normally you're telling the story of someone else. And I think that it's a very useful discipline for writers starting out to try not to even use the personal pronoun in their writing. That was something that I was told to do, and while I think of myself primarily as an editor, not a writer, I do think it was a very useful exercise for me. But if you've mastered those basics, I think that a judicious use of the personal pronoun, making yourself a character in the piece, can be really great if the story calls for it. And then you can become a character in the piece. But again, that's kind of like that's pretty advanced in terms of a long form stunt or achievement. So it's important to learn how to tell the story without yourself. And then once you can do that, maybe inject a little bit of yourself into it.
You've reminded me just now of one of the stories that you commissioned, one of your cover stories from last year, which was Conrad Marshall going through a branding experience. One of the staff writers for Good Weekend was on the front cover of the magazine, and the whole story was about trying to reinvigorate him as a brand and hiring an ad agency to reposition him as a smart and urbane writer, whatever it was.
Yes.
Was that his idea or yours?
It was. Conrad is just amazing with ideas. He is teeming with ideas, and that story in the hands of a lesser practitioner of the craft would be a disaster. Conrad has earned his stripes to the point where he can write a story where he is a character, and in fact he then did that a little later on in the year in another one of my favourite cover stories of the year, where he went to a ute muster. And he had a very muddy, unpleasant time, and his humour really came through there as well. And that was a first-person piece. But again, Conrad's allowed to, because Conrad's earned the right to tell those stories, because he already knows how to observe other people and to not be bringing himself into it. I get a lot of pitches from people who want to tell their own story, and that's fine, but the problem is at 3,000 or 4,000 words, if you are not used to writing at that length, you're likely not going to be able to tell your story in a way that gets someone through to the end. A lot of people have a lot of really compelling personal stories, but unless they have experience keeping a reader's attention all the way through at length, they're not likely to be able to pull it off. They need to watch other people first before they watch themselves.
It's really good advice. This podcast is all about working with words for a living. I've had journalists and writers and songwriters and authors on, and editors, including yourself, so it's really fascinating to hear different perspectives on how to deal with that core concept of storytelling. When it comes to length in terms of Good Weekend's features, you've had some interesting experiments with longer, I think maybe up to 6,000 or 7,000 words, if I'm correct.
I think the longest we've done is about 5, actually, and that's just. But I think it's true to say that what I have been interested in doing at Good Weekend is running fewer, longer stories, just because there are so few outlets in Australia that, or really anywhere, that are running stories at length. I wanted to focus on telling Australian stories at a longer length and in a more in-depth way.
How do you know the difference between a 3,000 word feature and a 5,000 word? Is it when you see the text on the page that you can start making those decisions, or is it when you first hear the idea pitched by a writer?
That's a really interesting question, because 3,000 and 5,000 are kind of my go-to lengths. I'll give a couple of examples. So, first of all, it's got nothing to do with the quality of the writer. or the quality of the assignment or the subject. It's here's an example. One of my favourite profiles of the year was by Melissa Fife, who is a Good Weekend staff writer in Melbourne, who is, by all accounts, an investigative journalist. Give her a pile of boxes of legal papers and she will find a cracker of a story hidden within them. That's a very particular skill set. She'd come off a number of incredible investigative pieces. I'm thinking, for instance, of her cover story about Slater and Gordon and the implosion of that once legendary law firm after they floated. And I wanted to give her a story. I like giving writers stories that are a little bit of a challenge or a stretch for them. And so I think it was actually Greg who assigned this story to Mel, but it was a wonderful assignment. He had her profile Bill Henson, the controversial photographer. She'd never really done a sort of straight up profile of an artist before, and it seems on the surface like an unusual assignment, but I was so pleased with the result because she applied her investigative rigor to the subject of an artist, and she approached it with such thoughtfulness and discipline that it was one of my favorite profiles of the year. Now that was, I think it was about 3,200 words. That's not because I think Bill Henson is not a great photographer. Who am I to say? It's sort of beside the point, actually, whether I think Bill Henson is a good photographer. The reason it was 3,200 words is because it was partially dependent on access. So she spent a morning with him at his house, but partially dependent on the way that she told the story. It was not... Again, she's not writing a sort of reflection on his entire career because that's not what she's qualified to do. It was kind of an encounter with a very interesting and high-profile artist with some thoughtful context around that encounter. That's 3,200 words.
Right.
So to contrast with that, Jane Cadzow, who needs no introduction.
Brilliant writer.
Jane came across this absolutely heartbreaking story that was our cover story last week concerning a young Indigenous man who was convicted of the murder of another young man in Western Australia. Now, the mother of the murdered man is trying to fight for the release of the young Indigenous man from prison because she doesn't think that he committed the murder. That was a pretty extraordinary story when I first heard about it, but I like to keep an open mind about length because, again, it's dependent on how the writer sees the story developing. And Jane came to me and said that there was just so much to talk about here. For instance, there was some discussion in the piece about the effect of fetal alcohol syndrome on people's behaviour later in life, a connection even to false confessions, and people who've suffered from this feeling intimidated by police and giving confessions that they might not mean to give. There was also the component of this mother who had her son murdered, who then turns around to fight for the release of the man that the state has said, in fact, murdered her son. It turned into, in effect, a profile of this mother. Now, that was also a profile, and on the surface, this man's mother is not as famous, quote-unquote, as Bill Henson, but the story, as Jane told it, because it had those digressions that I've talked about that were important to give you a full picture, turned out to be a 5,000-word piece. So I think that comparison's helpful because you might think that the more famous person might get more words, or you might think that because it's a more straightforward profile, then they might automatically get 5,000 words. It's not the way it works.
Is there a feeling that you've wanted readers to have after they've closed the last page of Good Weekend on a Saturday or whenever they get around to reading it? Is there an overall feeling that you have tried to sum up in the magazine's pages each week?
I want to give them unexpected perspectives on Australia and Australians. And sometimes, because I'm always searching for the unexpected, I can be surprised in the assignment process. So I'll give you 2 examples of that. 2 of my favorite cover stories. The first was about a transgender man named Eddie Ayres, who was an ABC radio presenter who moved to Afghanistan and finally confronted the fact that he was a man. So came back to Australia to have his gender reassignment surgery, and the story was about how Afghanistan had triggered that realization in him. The second cover story I want to mention in this context of surprise and the unexpected was a cover story about George Christensen, the former Nationals whip.
With a great cover photo.
With a fantastic cover photo by Andrew McMillen. In both those cases, the writer had never written a long-form piece before. Both of them were very experienced news reporters. Both of them approached me with the story idea. And to be honest, I was skeptical because, as I mentioned to you before, it's really hard to tell a story at length. But look at what a training you get as a news reporter. These 2, even though they'd never written a story at that length, they knew the bare bones of how to tell a story. They knew that it involves talking to people, again, watching people, that theme that I mentioned before. And they sent me these stories that basically required no editing. And to me, that is such a reminder that the best training for long form is short form. Because you just want to get practiced at watching people. To bring it back to your surprise, to my surprise point, you asked me what I want people to think when they finish reading the magazine. I want them to be surprised, and if I can be surprised along the way too, that's how I know it's going to be a good issue of the magazine. And in both those cases, I just thought you've just nailed it first time round.
We should mention the writers of those pieces. The Christensen profile was by Matthew Knott.
And the writer of the Eddie Ayres piece was Danielle Moylan.
The cover photo, or the cover story, is all important, of course. Is it a tight race sometimes between what wins that race each week?
Well, yeah, certainly it's important, and in the case of both George Christensen and Eddie Ayres, the Eddie Ayres photo was, of course, by the Gold Walkley Award winner Andrew Quilty, and the George Christensen photo, which was a blessing from above, was by Canberra Fairfax photographer Andrew Mears. So I have access to some of the most extraordinary photographers. Another one that I'd love to mention is Nick Walker, who has taken so many amazing photos for the magazine, but I'm thinking, for instance, of his photo of Barnaby Joyce that was on the cover early last year, where he almost made Barnaby Joyce look handsome if you squinted. And then Tim Bauer is another regular Good Weekend photographer who took the most amazing series of photos for Tim Elliott's cover story about a family in Sydney with the most heartbreaking story, which is that their children suffer from a rare genetic disease that means that they will die before they reach adulthood. Yeah. And so let me spend a little bit of time on that story, because you asked about what makes a cover story. Anything Tim Elliott writes is going to be beautiful, lyrical, astute, and funny, which is a pretty rare combination when you think about it. He has this ability to never lose his light touch, which I think is really important when you're writing about some pretty upsetting things, as Tim has written about. And his piece about this family was a perfect illustration of that light touch. That piece, without access to photographers like Tim Bauer, that piece would have been difficult to put on the cover, because you don't want to be exploitative. You also don't want to be unnecessarily dreary. It is called Good Weekend. The cover image can't be something that makes people turn away, even as you're asking them to confront some pretty difficult realities. But because I have access to photographers like Tim Bauer and Nick Walker, you have a lot of flexibility in terms of what you put on that cover, because the practitioners you're working with are so skilled. And that extends to the art director, Tim Bior, because Tim Bior can really come up with any cover for me. I mean, it's such a luxury. Last year we published a piece about the new face of death. Death's having a moment, and Jackie Dent. It's interesting, by the way, people. There are some stories that just sort of appear incredibly zeitgeisty, and all of a sudden I was getting pictures about death, and how death was something that people were taking a new look at. Jackie Dent wrote a wonderful series of mini portraits of people in the death industry trying to make death a less scary thing. I said to Tim Bior, we've got a cover story on death. What are you going to do? And he managed to come up with a cover which managed to be uplifting in its own way. And so that's the beauty of working with such talented art directors and photographers, is that my decision about what to put on the cover is pretty much purely editorial. It's not generally visual, in the sense that I don't have to think, well, I can't put that on the cover because it's not visual enough. I can put on the cover the story that I think speaks to the times the most.
We've mentioned quite a few stories already, and I will link to them all in the show notes so listeners can click through and see the images we're talking about, the photos, and read the words, of course. Quite a few Tim's work on Good Weekend.
Yeah, a lot of Tim's. I just want to mention one other cover that was a great example of Tim Bior's work. And Tim won the AMA's Designer of the Year for his work on Good Weekend. So it's not just me who thinks he's good. Stephanie Wood, who is also just an extraordinary writer, because she is an incredibly sensitive observer. She just sees everything about people. And she came to me to talk about the fact that she wanted to explore the fact that she is childless, but not by choice. I think we're very familiar with stories about stories which always sound a tiny bit defensive from people about how they would never want children. I was interested in the story of someone who's not being defensive about their choice, but is rather being vulnerable and honest about the fact that they didn't feel that they had a choice. And Stephanie pulled off this incredibly moving and honest piece about childless by chance, not choice. And again, I said to Tim, what are you going to do for that? And readers will probably, if you're a regular reader of Good Weekend, you'll probably remember the cover, because it was an incredibly iconic cover. It was a yellow. It again managed to make it seem like a story you actually wanted to turn to rather than turn away from. This cheery yellow cover with an egg carton, an open egg carton which did not have any eggs in it.
That's right. Yes, that is an iconic.
It was
cover.
Iconic in its own way, and the reason why that's such good work is because it's Saturday morning. I know you don't necessarily want to read the heaviest story around. At the same time, I don't want people turning away from a brilliant story that Stephanie's written. And Tim does the work for us of bringing the reader in. And then Stephanie's words do the work of getting us through the story. So it is really a team effort on a magazine.
It's a band, and you're the band
It
leader,
is.
I suppose, conducting them all, some kind of analogy like that. Sticking with this idea of editing, I've got plenty of other things that I want to ask you, but do you need to, when you see in your inbox one of your writers or one of your contributors has sent in a first draft, do you need to be in a particular headspace or time of day to sit down and take that all in one go, or what's your process there?
That's a really good question, because I know that writing is a really difficult thing, and when someone has written a piece, it can feel incredibly vulnerable and scary to send it off to the editor. I should probably be more conscious of the headspace that I'm in, but I'm not especially, but that's because I'm not a workaholic. I'm not someone who wants to, this is me being really honest now, I just don't want to work all the hours in the week. And I actually don't think that serves me as an editor anyway. I think it's really important that editors live lives and consume lots of content and culture and talk to lots of people. And I wouldn't want to be just hunched over a desk till all hours. So I don't work exceptionally long hours. I never have. And I think that enables me to be pretty fresh and tuned into my work when I'm at my desk. So I never thought about that. But I think that's part of my overall philosophy, that editors need to be living life in order to be... They need to be interested in a lot of different things. It's like that quote, which I don't know who to attribute it to. It's better to be interested than interesting. That's certainly true for editors, I think.
Will you always read a first draft through in one session, or will you sometimes get distracted by someone asking you something or something more urgent coming up?
It's difficult in an open plan office, which I work in. It has taken me some time to get used to that, but luckily I do have a little corner of my own. I'm not a big phone talker. I don't typically pick up the phone at work. So I don't have a lot of interruptions, actually. So yeah, I try and read it all the way through. I try and observe how I'm feeling on the way through. If I do get distracted, oh, here's a text message, maybe I want a coffee, that's a sign that the piece needs work.
Right.
So if I read it all the way through and then I'm surprised I've already reached the end, that's a sign that it's a really good piece. One thing I learned early on, when I first worked as an editor at the Paris Review, which is a literary quarterly in New York, I was that job involved a lot of assessing unsolicited manuscripts, because it was predominantly a literary journal. And at first I thought to myself, how can I tell if this is good or not? How can I tell if this piece is good? And it was a little bit scary for me. And then I realized that no one knows anything, and that editing is not brain surgery. And in fact, the way I can tell if a piece is good is if I enjoy reading the piece.
Trust your instincts kind of thing.
Yes. I mean, that's why I also think it's very important as an editor of a magazine to not be constantly thinking about the reader, which again is going to shock people and probably will shock some of my bosses here. But a good magazine has to be reflective of the vision of its editor. And if my bosses don't like the vision, then they can get rid of me. But all I can do is put out what I think is interesting. And that, to me, creates a coherent, exciting product.
That's really interesting to hear, because at one level it sounds fairly selfish to just put out the magazine that you like and want to read, but it also makes complete sense, because if you're not putting out the magazine that you want to read, then what's the point? Who are you serving exactly?
Exactly. It reminds me of one of my first editorial meetings at the New Yorker. So there was an ideas meeting once a week. You had to bring 3 ideas. My first meeting, I literally brought an idea about, it was something about casino regulations on Native American reservations. And I'm sure that is interesting. I don't know enough about it to be interested in it. I shouldn't have pitched a story I wasn't interested in. I pitched it because I thought it seemed serious and worthy.
Worthy, yes.
But we're not a charity. We're meant to be putting out a magazine that people want to read. So I am a big fan of mixing high and low. So on my desk right now, unfortunately, I have Gwyneth Paltrow's new holistic health handbook, because I was interested in reading it. And I've also got a new book looking at Helen Garner's writing career. And I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit to you that I'm interested in Gwyneth Paltrow, but I am. I think she's a really interesting pop culture phenomenon and business person. And to be a magazine editor who looks down on things that are objectively major cultural phenomena, I don't think that you're going to make a very interesting magazine. So if I'm not interested in it, I won't assign it, and I certainly won't want to read it.
Can we talk about editorial blind spots?
Yes.
Because I discovered one of yours
last
year. I pitched you a story about fireworks.
Oh.
And you were like, no thanks.
Yeah.
This guy doesn't sound very interesting. And then I really wanted to write about fireworks. So I went back and found this 4th generation family business in Queensland who's been in fireworks for like 60 years. I'm like, Amelia, I really want to write this fireworks story. What do you think? And you're like, no, I just don't care about fireworks.
No, I'm just not interested in fireworks. And every editor has blind spots. And all I can do is put out a magazine I find interesting. I learned this from David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, who has plenty of things he's not interested in. Among them, he's not that interested in animals. You've got to work pretty hard to pitch him an animals piece. Nor is he that interested in space. Fireworks is something I'm not very interested in. There are certainly other things I'm not very interested in, which I can't remember because they occupy no space in my brain.
Yeah.
But we could do a rapid fire game where I could tell you whether I'm interested in something. But that's really the only litmus test. To bring it back to that very good question you asked about how I read a piece, all I can do in the piece is continually perform a gut check. I'm very interested in guts and intestines, which is why we ran a piece on them last week. You just got to continually ask yourself, is this interesting?
And if you notice your attention flagging...
If you notice that you're replying to a text message that you had previously been procrastinating about, it's a sign that the draft is not working.
Mm-hmm. All right. That's good. That's been a good introduction. We've got a lot of content there. I want to do a quick recap of your career to date, or your life to date, I suppose. Born in Paris, 1 sibling, economist parents, spent some time in New Delhi as a young child, most of your life in Australia throughout your childhood and adolescence. Went to a prestigious girls' school here in Sydney on the North Shore.
A public girls' school.
Public girls' school, yes.
Yep.
Applied to Harvard on something of a whim.
Yep.
Got in.
I'm very whim-driven.
Started law, didn't like it, and started arts, or focused on English?
So the American university system is such that generally at undergraduate level everyone does a liberal arts degree. So I majored in English, but you have to do maths classes and language classes and science classes, so it's a sort of big jumble.
Mm-hmm. I found some of your articles for the Harvard magazine.
That's horrifying.
From 2005.
Yep.
What age would you have been then?
In 2005, I had a fellowship from Harvard Magazine to write from the perspective of an undergraduate. So Harvard Magazine, a magazine for alums, Harvard alums. That was my first paid journalism, and the column was called The Undergraduate. And I wrote a piece, my final piece for Harvard Magazine was about how all my peers were getting jobs, and I didn't know how to get a job. But that's not something anyone had ever explained to me. I didn't even know, really. I thought a cover letter was a summary of your resume, which, as someone who turned out to be an editor, I really should have thought that through and realized that you should not repeat the information of the resume and the cover letter. But that took me a few years. So I wrote this piece about how I didn't know how to find a job, and that's how I got a job, which was working at a literary agency called the Wiley Agency, where I was the assistant to Andrew Wiley, who is otherwise known as the Jackal. He has quite a fierce reputation in the literary world for cutting big deals for his writers.
The Harvard Magazine pieces were good, so don't feel horrified.
Good.
Like, the voice was clear, your perspective was strong.
Thank you.
There was a lot of of course, being about an undergraduate.
And by the way, I don't practice what I preach. I don't have reporting experience, and that's why I'm good at recognizing it in others, I think.
Uh-huh. So those were your first paid journalism or first published pieces in the public domain?
And I remember my editor, who was a fantastic guy, John Rosenberg, really skilled editor, once sent me an email where he said of my column that my prose was a bit purple. Is that an American expression, or is this...
Purple prose is like overly florid language.
Yes, exactly. And I think that my time at The New Yorker really influenced my writing and preferences in other people's writing to really pare things down, but we can get to that.
Mm-hmm. So tell me a bit about the literary agency lifestyle with Wiley.
Well, it was a pretty intense introduction to adulthood. The job was quite demanding. I was Andrew's assistant, and I had to work from 8:30 to 5:30. You were not permitted a lunch break as such. A lady came around with sandwiches on a cart. And
what were you doing? How were you filling your hours at that point?
I was writing emails to publishers and editors, chasing up on deals and figuring out how to get the best deals for our writers. It was a job not without its glamour. Salman Rushdie and Philip Roth would call regularly, not to talk to me, but to talk to Andrew.
Amelia, how's it going?
Well, they're both very friendly, actually, I should add, particularly Philip Roth. But it was great to be around the business of writing, and to be reminded that look, agents have a really important role because they make sure that writers can make a living. And I think I've got nothing but respect for what the Wiley Agency does, because they're always focused on how can we monetize this creative work that is pulling out people's heart and soul. So that's what they're there for. So and it was a very good discipline for me to be in a job like that, because you just think, oh, this is what a job is. Like, you have to work these hours, and you have to not do any personal email during the day, and you just have to have your head down. So I was grateful to the Wiley Agency for that job, and also for the ability to arrive in New York and start making a life there was courtesy of the Wiley Agency. I thought I was just going to be there for a year, but I ended up staying 11.
New York, that is.
Yes. No, I couldn't have lasted 11 years at the Wiley Agency.
Yeah, right. So what year was that?
2005.
2005, okay.
And then I got a job at the New Yorker in 2006, just as my visa was running out.
What were you reading for pleasure around that time in your life?
All the reading I did at the Wiley Agency, and I think this is quite a common thing in book publishing, all of it is related to your work, because you don't get any time to read at work when you're in book publishing. You read on the weekends. I'm not going to pretend that I wasn't also enjoying $3 margaritas quite a bit during the time I was not going home and really cracking the books. But on the weekend I had to read a lot of manuscripts. So I remember reading Elizabeth Gilbert's Eat, Pray, Love when it first came in, because she was a Wiley client. Right. And thinking, this is such a good idea. And then also being blown away by Julie and Julia. Remember that memoir that was turned into the Meryl Streep movie? About Julia Child, and then this food blogger in Queens who've cooked all her food.
Right.
It was a little bit of a one-hit wonder by Julie Powell, but she had a really great voice, and I remember just tearing through that one day. You just had to read all of the books by the Wiley clients and then write reports on them. So it was it was a time where reading was associated with work and being studious.
Mm-hmm. Did that diminish its pleasure for you?
A little bit. I've never been a member of a book club because I don't like other people telling me what to read. It strikes me as the ultimate imposition.
Right. Where or what role did the New Yorker play in your life then, before you joined it?
Well, I loved the New Yorker, and I had loved it ever since I read an article in late 2004 by David Gran, who remains one of my favorite writers, about the what would ultimately become his book, The Lost City of Z. And yes, I said Z because I'm talking about an American.
Soon to be a film, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's right. I couldn't believe that there was a magazine that had sent a writer off for months to track a lost civilization in South America in the jungle. It just blew my mind. So I desperately wanted to work there, and I had a friend whose boyfriend, a friend at work at the Wiley Agency, whose boyfriend was a fact checker at the New Yorker. And it was a real race against the clock because my visa was running out. And also I'd been told that fact checkers were typically a little bit more advanced in their careers, and also they typically had another language, and I did not have another language despite my many years of French. So it was a bit of a long shot. And look, my connection was my colleague's boyfriend was a fact checker. He has gone on to have a huge career as a long-form editor. His name is Jonathan Shainan, and he runs, or last time I checked, he was running The Guardian's long-form operation out of London. Mm-hmm. But I will be forever grateful to Jonathan for getting me that interview with the head of the fact-checking department. And it was a very rigorous interview. It went for an hour. And I remember talking a lot about campaign finance reform, which I did not know a lot about, but which...
Were you bullshitting?
A little bit.
You bullshit your way into New Yorker. That's great.
I've always been very interested in politics, and so this was in the lead up to the 2008 election. Remember the 2008 election? Mm-hmm. And they needed very lead up, but that's American politics for you. 2006. They're like, we've got to gear up for this election in 2 years' time. So I've always had a big interest in politics, and in particular American politics. So I was faking it to some extent, but not completely.
Do you remember the first time you entered that building for that interview?
I do. It was in Times Square, and I had a friend who worked at Condé Nast Traveller, because it's in the Condé Nast building, and I just thought her life was so glamorous, and I desperately wanted to work at Condé Nast. I desperately wanted to work at The New Yorker, and I had to sneak away from work because, as mentioned, you were not permitted to take breaks from your desk. So I had a lot of dentist appointments that spring, and then I went in for the interview, and it was just the most exciting thing. But even more than that, I remember the first piece that I checked was a comment, which is the first piece in the magazine, in the Talk of the Town section, and readers of The New Yorker will remember that there's a distinctive kind of illustration at the top of that page. And I remember the proof coming to my desk for me to check, and I just could not believe that I was getting to work at The New Yorker and putting marks on a page that would end up in the magazine.
So it was hard copy editing, not on a computer. It was with pen and paper marker?
Yes, The New Yorker still uses pen and paper, and that was one adjustment I had to make coming to Good Weekend, is that I now do editing on the screen, which is quite different from what I was used to. But they have a very elaborate system because every word in the magazine is really agonized over by 4, 5, 6 people. So there's a whole system whereby this single piece of paper is routed to all those different people for changes, which culminates in something called a closing meeting, where each of the stakeholders in a piece, not that they would ever use such a corporate word as stakeholders, but each of the people involved in the piece sit around a table, much like the one that we are at, and then they go around and say their piece on each page before the page goes to the printer.
Mm-hmm. You were one of 17 fact checkers?
Yes.
What kind of skills were required, and what kind of skills did you learn on the job?
I think it was actually 15 when I started, and they expanded when the website expanded. So each of the fact checkers, the head of the fact checking department, Peter Canby, has been doing the job for many years, and it's pretty much sort of a given in New York that if you are a reasonably well-connected 22-year-old, you will have an interview with Peter Canby. And so he's just seen it all, and I guess he has an ability to pick fact checkers via intuition, because generally, some of them have amazing master's degrees in those 7 languages, but I think he picks them primarily for intellectual curiosity, because The New Yorker is about anything and everything, and in fact, in some cases, expertise can be a liability because you assume that you know things.
Right.
When you don't, and it can lead to carelessness and complacency. So I did a lot of pieces, I checked a lot of pieces about the Middle East and about Israel and the various conflicts in that region, and I didn't know anything about it. But in some ways, it makes you a better checker, because you have to check everything, beginning with how to spell Gaza.
Right.
And you just have to approach the story knowing that by the end of that process you will have a holistic understanding of it, so that you will be able to assess not only the micro level details of the piece, for instance the spelling or the
age of people,
but also the narrative coherence of it and the fairness of it, and whether or not the writer has missed a huge chunk of narrative that doesn't serve his or her argument.
It's re-reporting in a sense, because you're researching those facts independently and also calling up the people quoted.
Exactly. It is re-reporting, and at Vanity Fair the fact checkers are called reporter researchers, but the New Yorker prefers to use its arcane terminology. But I had to get over my fear of calling people on the phone, because I had never really reported much before, and I thought it was really scary, the idea of calling someone up and just asking them a question, and maybe asking them a question that is not a particularly friendly question. But then I just sort of got over it and realized that everyone likes talking about themselves, number one, which helps, and number two, as long as you ask questions in a polite way, I think manners are very important in journalism. I've never said that out loud before, but I really think it's true. I think it's very important to show respect to everyone with whom you come into contact, because we as practitioners of the craft do not understand how terrifying it is, I think, to see your name in print or to see your name in a story. And I just think it's very important to show respect and manners to people in this incredibly stressful time in their lives. Either something terrible has happened to them, or something big has happened to them, or they're about to see their name in print, and it's important to approach that with a sense of respect for the occasion. So I just tried to be very polite with people, even when asking them pretty invasive questions, and I found that it went a long way. Like you can pretty much ask anyone anything as long as you ask it respectfully, I think. And they may not answer you, but that they will appreciate that you showed them that respect.
I believe you also asked a certain rapper how much he weighed.
Fat Joe, 370 pounds. Or 270 pounds. Gosh, I don't know. Yes, I did find out how much he weighed. I mean, I had to ask people all sorts of horrible questions, like about the fact that someone had said they'd had an affair, or about the fact that they ruined their company. And the thing is that at least you're paying them the courtesy of getting their side of the story. That's the wonderful thing about being a fact checker, is it's the most self-righteous, sanctimonious position to be in, because you say, I'm on the side of truth in this. If the whole story falls apart, I don't care. I just want to figure out what the actual truth of this situation is. I
just want to know how much you weigh, Joe. That's all that really matters to me.
And I think, but that is like a form of respect too, because getting little details of a person's life right is a sign of respect. And if someone's name is spelled wrong, or if you get a tiny little detail of their life wrong, like for instance, you said to me before that I was born in Paris. A lot of people assume that because I'm Australian, I was born in Australia. Like, now I don't really care, but it's a sign that you've done your homework and that you care about getting the details of my life right. And that's why details are so important.
How would you describe David Remnick to someone who had never heard him or seen him or read his work?
He is just the most magnificent writer, editor, and boss. And he made me understand that he's the least snobby person you'll ever meet. So he does this thing where he walks around the office and he comes by your desk and he says, what are you reading? Or what did you watch yesterday? Or like, what play did you see? Or in my case, what restaurant did you eat at last night? And he's just a brilliant reporter because he gets you to open up and to share your enthusiasms and your interests. And he doesn't care if it was, like, sometimes I'd say I went to the opera and sometimes I'd say I went to the latest blockbuster, and to him both those things are equally interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that the New Yorker, which is sometimes seen as an intimidating place, is actually an incredibly egalitarian place, and it comes from the top. David is not interested in holding judgment on whether something is worthwhile or quality enough. If it's interesting, it's interesting, full stop. He's also a very wonderful boss, and that set me on a path where I think the most important thing in terms of taking jobs, and this is more relevant advice for editors rather than writers, obviously, is you should look for a boss from whom you can learn and who's also a good person, because you're going to give a lot of yourself to your job, and you want to work for someone who you really feel good about working for.
Mm-hmm. He's been editor of The New Yorker since 1999. I think it was, you can tell me the year, but at one point a managing editor job came up and you emailed David Remnick to say, what did you say exactly? Do you remember?
Yeah, it was 2009, and the world was yet to implode in the financial crisis, so things still seemed possible and wonderful. And summer 2009, and I was having dinner with my parents and my brother. And
in New York, where they all lived for a time?
Yes, exactly. They were all living there. We had a glass of wine, and I was like, there's this job. And I'd always gotten along with David, and I missed The New Yorker. I was working at the Paris Review at the time. And my family said, well, you should just go for it. I mean, that's just the kind of people they are. I think a lot of people would have thought that was a bit unconventional for a 26-year-old to ask to be managing editor, but they didn't see any reason why I shouldn't. So I sent him, again, a polite email. You don't know what you're going to get until you ask for it. So I asked if he'd consider me. And he called me in, and obviously we already knew each other very well, but he said, look, you're 26 years old. And I said, yeah, I can't really do anything about that, David. And he just decided to give me a shot. I'm sure partly because I was a lot cheaper than a lot of the other people going for that job. But I think he also, I don't mean to undersell David, I think he also really thought that he likes hungry people, as he would put it. He likes people who are really going to throw themselves into it. And by the way, when I said before I don't particularly like working long hours, it doesn't mean that I don't pour myself into a job. It just means that there's no point being a martyr about it and sitting at your desk for 16 hours a day. So he said, let's give it a shot. And then I did that job for about 4 years.
A bit more responsibility than being a fact checker at The New Yorker?
You know, not really.
No?
I've got to say that being a fact checker is, you were given an incredible amount of agency and independence, and the radical transparency of that job is really quite something. Like, as you move up the career ladder, obviously there's less and less, how do I put this? There's less and less transparency about the job you're doing, in a sense, because you can sort of hide behind the layers of hierarchy. As a fact checker, if there is a mistake in the piece that you checked, it is on you. So you just got to work really hard to make sure there isn't a mistake. That's actually why I really like my job right now as editor too, because there's also a transparency to it. It's the buck stops with me. If you think that the magazine is boring, that's my fault. And I sort of like having that product that I can point to. So as managing editor, that's obviously a slightly different job from both of those, in the sense that you are helping other people do their jobs. You're facilitating other people's jobs. And the magazine is David Remnick's vision. But it was a fantastic learning experience, because you really got to see every single aspect of how a magazine works.
The New Yorker, like Good Weekend, is a weekly publication. Can you give me a snapshot of an average week as managing editor?
Every week was very different, because that's in part because David, as editor, his particular stamp is to talk about he wants the New Yorker to feel of the news and of the world. So it's very responsive to the news under David, and in fact breaks news a lot of the time. Previous editors have taken different approaches. Tina Brown was, for instance, less news-driven. It started off as a humour magazine, so there's no particular doctrine as to what the New Yorker should be, but David's New Yorker is right there in the midst of the news cycle. So the news cycle it looks like just a complete other era now, and I guess it's because it is, but 2009 to 2012-ish, which is when I did 2013-ish, which is when I did the job till it felt very frantic, but looking back on it, it was positively leisurely. But if you did have a big news story break, then your whole week would become about that news story. So the news of Osama bin Laden's assassination, President Obama went on TV to talk about that on a Sunday night. And I was currently commuting in a sense to Chicago at that time, so I knew, okay, my commute tomorrow, I'm going to have to hit the ground running when I get back to New York. And then we basically pulled up the whole magazine that we planned for that week to focus on Osama bin Laden. The same thing happened with the Japanese earthquake. So it was in a large part dependent on the news, and you hoped that famous people didn't die on a Thursday because the production cycle was such that Friday was production day.
Right. And there would be weekly story meetings where people bring ideas? Or... Yeah,
weekly story meetings where pretty much anyone from around the office is invited, from an assistant to a writer. And then you're planning ahead. As managing editor, I was responsible for the next batch of issues for approximately 3 months out. But then you have to be thinking about the pipeline beyond those 3 months. So not only are you thinking about those 3 months, but you're also thinking, we really need some more cultural profiles, or we really need some more short pieces for the front of the mag. So you're thinking in kind of a long-term sense, and then in a very long-term sense.
Yeah.
And then you're overseeing the weekly production cycle. So you're always kind of existing in 3 different time zones, which worked for an Australian in New York.
Yeah. So how many staff writers does the New Yorker have, or did it have at that time?
The New Yorker is very dependent on staff writers. I'd say about 90% of the magazine is staff writers. I think, an estimate would be maybe 30, but at any given time there's always a bunch of staff writers on book leave. So that can vary quite radically.
And that includes people like David Gran and Malcolm Gladwell, I think.
Yes, yep. Janet Malcolm, Jane Mayer, George Packer, John Lee Anderson, yep.
How often did or does the New Yorker take pictures from people outside the tent or freelancers? Or
It does happen, but typically now, because NewYorker.com has become such a big functioning ecosystem of its own, that's typically now the gateway into the magazine, because the editors of the magazine will want to see evidence of the reporter's work, and that's always better if it comes from NewYorker.com. So my very practical advice to people would be to have a close look at NewYorker.com and tailor pictures to the website. That's one way to get noticed by the print editors.
Around that time, towards the end of your managing editor job, I believe you started doing the tables for 2.
Yes, actually, mid managing editor.
Right.
Yeah.
They're not quite restaurant reviews. How would you describe tables for 2?
Well, tables for 2 is in the goings on about town section of the magazine, which is the front section of the magazine, and that section, anecdotally, is loved by people who don't live in New York, which is funny because it's essentially a listing section. But you've got to keep in mind that 90% of New Yorker readers live outside of New York City. So there's a reason why the New Yorker keeps publishing page after page of cultural listings, and it's not for their own benefit. It's because we get the feedback that people love reading about what's happening in New York. And it's a very important part of the sort of vision that the New Yorker expresses to the world. Magazines are all about articulating a certain worldview, and the New Yorker's worldview, part of that is looking outward and being very cosmopolitan and global, but part of it's also about really relishing life in New York City and all of its cultural possibilities and opportunities. So Tables for Two is not telling you where to eat or what to order. It's creating a sense of being there in New York, having a meal. Since restaurants in New York are where life happens, restaurants, it's impossible to overstate their importance to people's lives. People track entire love affairs based on where they ate. You can walk down Bleecker Street and think about how each restaurant there indicates a different important life moment. So Tables for Two is almost a very short 450-word vignette of what it was like to be in a particular restaurant on a particular night in New York City.
Did you enjoy doing that? You did it for a couple of years at least.
Oh yeah, I must have done it for about 3 or 4 years, and I just I did enjoy it very much. I mean, I ate out every night. It was probably terrible for my cholesterol, but I was doing it anyway. Everyone does it in New York anyway, and it was really helpful for my writing again because I don't know anything about food really, and that's another thing people are going to be. There are so many great pull quotes from this. I don't care about readers. I don't know about food. I'm waiting for the Australians hit piece on me. But I don't know about food, and I wasn't pretending that I did. What I was trying to do was, again, create an atmosphere, enable the reader to feel that they are in the restaurant there. And it says so much about the culture too. Like in my time in New York, restaurants moved from trying to appear as glitzy and as opulent as possible to embracing farm to table and mason jars and sort of a very rustic aesthetic, which happened to coincide with the financial crisis, to then coming out of that and wanting to embrace all things Nordic and a much sort of cleaner, more pared down look and an experience. And none of that's coincidence. None of that is disconnected from what's happening in the broader society at the time. New York, over the time I was there, from 2005 to 2016, changed dramatically. And I could track that through restaurants.
Would they have been your first published pieces since the Harvard magazine, those first Tables for Two pieces?
Yeah.
Did you, maybe it's hard to recall now, but did you struggle to find the confidence at first with getting the tone right and that sort of thing?
No, because I'm very opinionated about good food.
Even though you know nothing about it, apparently.
I know when I see it.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I just think it was something I was passionate about and excited about. And I also think that life in New York shaped me as an individual just because I was there from all through my 20s, and wherever you spend your 20s is going to shape you. And you just can't be much of a wallflower there. It's not going to work. You're not going to get anywhere. No one's impressed by your false modesty. So you just have to recognize what you're good at and then aggressively go after that. So yeah, I didn't really develop the humility gene in that regard.
Would you get good feedback from editors or readers about those pieces, or?
Sometimes good, sometimes not so good. Again, like, it's sort of the way that I think about editing now. It's like, this is the purest expression of how I enjoyed this burger. And if you don't like it, then don't read it.
You became executive editor of NewYorker.com 2013.
I was going on about town editor briefly in between because I worked on the relaunch. It had never, that front section had never been redesigned since the New Yorker first started publishing in the 20s. So I was eager to figure out how to refashion it. So I worked on that for a time, and I really like making things over, so that was a really fun exercise. And then I moved from that to working on the relaunch of the website when I was executive online editor.
So you were hands off the print version, you were focused only on the website, is that correct? Mm-hmm. Did that change your workflow or what you had to deal with on a weekly basis noticeably? Me
shifting over to the web for me happened to coincide with that speeding up of the news cycle that was starting to happen. it was around the time, it was a little bit after Twitter had really taken a hold of journalists everywhere. But it felt like things were speeding up. So it felt like the right time to speed up my own workday too. And it was a terrific experience. Oh, I can't say terrific anymore. I feel like Donald Trump's ruined that word. Let me scratch that. It was a very stimulating exercise to think about how this brand that is known for reflection, consideration, and long-form journalism adapts to the digital era and remains relevant. And that was very much the question that I was grappling with when I was doing that job. It was sort of a case of, when news happened, well, how do we cover this or respond to this in a New Yorker-y way? And I think we came up with a certain kind of formula which you still see on NewYorker.com today.
Did planning that digital strategy involve knowing what you wanted to avoid, certain types of coverage or types of writing which you and your team realised would not serve readers well and would not be on message for the New Yorker?
Yeah, so a couple of examples of things that I can't even really take credit for, but which I think encapsulate the approach that we were going for. Elements, the science blog, edited by Anthony Lydgate, who, again, I'm not taking any credit for it. He did a wonderful job figuring out that I happen to think that daily scientific exploration in a curious way is so New Yorker-y, and there's not a lot of it being done elsewhere, and it's done with humor and a lightness about it. It's not a scientific journal. I think Elements is a perfect example of what NewYorker.com should be, and also Daily Shouts, which is the Daily Shouts and Murmurs, the humor piece that appears in the weekly magazine. There's now a daily humor piece. Again, no credit for that. That was Emma Allen, who's just been appointed humor editor at the New Yorker in recognition of her fantastic work on Daily Shouts. But both of those take the essence of the magazine and speed it up. And I think reporting is also an important part of that. So endless analysis is not quite right. That's not really the New Yorker, talking about the horse race and talking about who's ahead in the polls, all written by someone in an armchair. That doesn't really feel New Yorker-y. Talk of the Town, if you think about it, was kind of like the original blog post in terms of the way it was written. Those are like 700-word pieces that feature watching someone really carefully and then writing about it. That's something, incidentally, that I've also introduced A Good We Can with Minutes with, which is a front section interview, which Amanda Hooton is just the master of. Watching someone carefully, writing about what you saw, that's something that is in short supply on the internet. Opinions are not in short supply, but that work is in short supply. So we tried to emphasize that.
Around that time, over a couple of years, you would occasionally write about Australia or Australian politics.
Occasionally.
There are three pieces that I came across. One was about Richard Flanagan winning the Booker Prize.
Yes, and that was because I commissioned Richard when I was managing editor to write a piece about Mona.
The David Walsh profile. Fantastic.
Yes, and that was before he'd won the Booker, and
called The Gambler, I believe, or that's how it also ran in the Monthly in Australia.
Yes, the Monthly bought it from the New Yorker.
Yes,
that was just that's a once in a lifetime experience to work with Richard Flanagan, and I'm so happy that it turned out he kept talking about his book while he was writing that, and how this was taking time away from his book. And then the book came out and won the Booker, and I was like, well, thanks for taking the time out. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I was really honoured to work with him on that. So when he won the Booker, I was pretty pleased.
Well, it did take him, 12 years, I believe, that book, Narrow Road to the Deep
Yeah,
North.
on and off. Yeah.
You also wrote about Tony Abbott no longer being Prime Minister of Australia, and you wrote about Julia Gillard's misogyny speech.
Yeah, that was the first one that I wrote, and I was very reluctant to do so, but the editor of NewYorker.com, Nick Thompson, who is now editor of Wired, was a very persuasive figure, and those were two moments, the misogyny speech and Tony Abbott, where Americans took a rare interest in Australia. it only happens. It's sort of like a once in blue moon experience to have an American actually ask you something about Australia. So when it happens, you got to seize the day.
Right.
It happened after the Turnbull phone call.
Yes.
Every now and then Americans are like, oh, Australia exists.
Were you following Australian news from New York, or were you just kind of disconnected?
No, very much so. I read smh.com.au every day, and I feel very connected with the news here. I grew up in a very politically conscious household, and we always talked about the news, and I always knew that I wanted to come back here at some point, so it was important to me to keep that connection.
Mm-hmm. Well, coming towards the end, I suppose, tell me about the transition from The New Yorker to Good Weekend.
Well, it was fantastic because no longer was I working for someone else. I was able to put out a magazine that was exactly reflective of my own interests. So what's not to like? And when I arrived, Darren Goodsir, who was editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, was incredibly supportive, and he saw immediately that we needed to, if we were to be churning out reliably quality work every week, staff writers, which Good Weekend had once had, it was important to restore that stable. So he enabled me to hire staff writers, which was something I was very grateful for. There were a few, but he gave me permission to expand it out. So the team of writers, just to have those incredibly skilled, experienced people writing about things that they're passionate about and occasionally about things that I'm interested in, has been a very special experience.
Was that another example of you seeing a job advertised and sending a sneaky email to someone, or was there a more formal
No,
process?
I didn't see a job advertised. In fact, Ben Napastek very generously put me in touch with Darren when I was coming back to Australia for a visit.
Right.
And Darren and I had lunch with Stephen Hutchin, who is the digital editor of SMH, and we discussed the job then. I, in fact, wasn't seeing it as a job interview. It was kind of me just making a visit back and making contact, but the timing was good.
Yeah, right. And you started about a year ago, or early 2016?
Yeah, January 2016.
Right.
Yeah.
And you are sadly leaving soon,
Yes.
which we'll come to soon. How did you prepare for stepping into this role of Good Weekend, having lived in New York,
Yeah.
paying attention to the news, but probably not closely reading the other weekend magazines and the competition? Did you come in with particular ideas of what you wanted to do or didn't want to do?
Well, I wasn't that interested in scoping out the competition because I had a clear idea of what I thought Good Weekend was because I'd read it since childhood. Right. So to me it was sort of irrelevant what other people were doing. I wanted to build on the tradition of Good Weekend, which I had a pretty firm understanding of because I'd been reading it for so many years. So but look, I had to relearn Australia, and I don't think I'm an expert yet. It took me 15 years to become an America expert, which I can now pretty confidently call myself. It might take me as long again to become an Australia expert.
In the job week to week, were you reading the competition, seeing what other magazines were assigning and putting on the cover and that sort of thing?
I really love the monthly, and I have always loved reading the monthly. So I was reading that, but I think it's more important to immerse, rather than reading the competition. I think it is very important for a magazine editor to immerse his or herself in the news. So really getting reacquainted with Australian news and a who's who of Australian politics and culture was my number one priority, rather than what's the competition doing.
How did you go about, or how have you gone about handling the budgets and the ads and the commercial side of thing?
That was a learning curve because I hadn't really had any experience with that at the New Yorker. But it's been really interesting because I never had to think about it before, and it was interesting to think about how to make pitches to advertisers. And we now have these 4 gloss issues each year, which are themed, which I've sort of crafted with it's an interesting balance trying to figure out how do I make this appealing to advertisers but also make it a sumptuous and immersive reading experience. And I actually really like figuring out that balance and being reminded that magazines are a business, because it gets back to that previous point. This is not a community service. I'm not here to as such make the world a better place. I'm here to make your Saturday more enjoyable. And keeping your eye on the prize in that way, it's good to be reminded of the fact that we also need to make money.
Maybe a fairly banal question, but you seem to be, based on my correspondence with you, you seem to be fairly on top of your email inbox. Is that a skill that you learned at the New Yorker?
At the Wiley Agency, where we were taught even how to craft your salutations to people. But I actually love talking about email inboxes. My system is very simple. I only open an email if I have time to deal with it. And if I'm really curious to read about it and don't have time to deal with it, I simply mark it as unread again. So at any given time, I have some unread emails in my inbox, so that's actually, back to your previous point about when I read pieces, I won't open the piece until I have time to read the piece all the way through. I should have said that before. So if someone has sent me a piece, it will remain unread as an email until I have time to deal with the piece. That's it.
How many pitches are you getting from just per week? How many pitches are you getting per week, roughly?
I can't take a lot of freelance pieces because of the staff writers,
even from staff writers.
I sort of don't regard them as the same, because the staff writers I sort of see as team members who need to be kept busy. So that's sort of a slightly different thing. It has been a shift in terms of budgets, because I probably do need to be a little bit more attuned to money. Not my strong suit.
Your parents are economists. How did that not trickle down?
I'm sure there's something a psychoanalyst could figure out there. But
doesn't your brother work in finance?
Yes.
He really missed you.
Yeah, I use a debit card because I don't want to get involved in thinking about anything. If the money's there, it's there. I can't take a lot of freelance pitches, and so I think over time I've gotten fewer, and I tend to rely on a few trusted freelancers. But again, such as yourself. But again, I mentioned before the fact that two of my favourite pieces came from people who hadn't written long form before. So you've always got to be got to keep one eye open.
Not be completely closed to everything.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. You have a very pleasant email manner. I deal with quite a few editors, and I got to say yours is like the most cheery and dependably positive.
Oh, that's
like
nice.
some editors I struggle
nice.
to get 3 words out of. You're always, even like if I file a draft or I pitch a story, you'll say no cheerfully, or you'll say it's good and it needs these things. Like you kind of do the sandwich thing.
So
compliment.
Nice.
Challenge, compliment.
Although you mentioned it, rather than compliment sandwich now, I've heard the latest in HR thinking is the compliment bruschetta. It's an open-faced sandwich, because apparently they decided that if you give a compliment, then the feedback, then the compliment. Humans being humans only hear the compliments that bookended the feedback. Anyway, that's not really a conscious thing on my part, but I think that's a very nice thing to say. Number one, I think it goes back to the respect point, and writing is hard, and I really try and show respect to writers in the work that they're doing, so I like to take the time to write back to them politely. And then secondly, I really like writing. I guess email, it's so great that we now live in a world where we predominantly communicate through writing.
No, it's been great working with you, and it is coming to an end. As I mentioned previously, you are about a month left in the job, or 5 weeks. Where are you off to?
I'm going to Japan. And I don't speak Japanese, before you ask. Andrew is giving me a very quizzical look
your
for the benefit
partner...
of the listeners. I'll tell you what. So, yes, I'm moving to Japan, and it's because my husband-to-be is in the US Navy, and he's a doctor, and he's getting stationed in Japan for a couple of years. And I've always wanted to have adventures and to live a kind of big, interesting life, just like magazines should be big and interesting, full of ads. So I'm seizing this opportunity for adventure, and I'm going to be working. I've got a few projects already lined up that I would love to talk about, but which I should wait on. And I will also be writing. I'd love to give myself the chance to do that.
I look forward to reading what you end up publishing, because what little I've read of your writing so far I've enjoyed.
Thank you.
I'm sure others will as well. It's been great talking to you, Amelia.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Penmanship, and thank you to my guest, Amelia Lester. You can find show notes to this episode, including links to all of the stories we discussed, at penmanshippodcast.com. If you have feedback for me, including people you'd love to hear me interview or other notes on the show itself, I'd love to hear from you. Andrew at penmanshippodcast.com is my email. If you enjoyed this podcast, there are several ways you can support it. You can leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or wherever else you happen to be listening to this podcast. You can also share it with people in your life who value and love reading great Australian writing and hearing great practitioners talk about working on words. You can also find the show on Twitter at PenmanshipAU and on Facebook. The theme song, as ever, is Eternally Yours by Laughing Clowns. That's it for now. Until next time.